This is the contemporary European security system, and today we are on to class number 8, in which we're going to talk a little bit about the new interventionism. This class is based quite closely on the chapter from Cotty's book, New Security Problems in Europe, and the first part of the chapter goes into some detail on the idea of humanitarian intervention. And to start off this topic, I've got a picture here of a couple of armoured vehicles on some kind of mission. The vehicles are painted white, and in black letters we could see UN. Obviously that stands for the United Nations, and also the flag of the UN flying here. And this, I'm not entirely sure exactly where this is, but it looks as though that the military forces here are on some kind of mission to bring humanitarian relief. Possibly there's been some kind of natural disaster or something here. There seems to be a lot of mess in the photograph. Okay, let's consider briefly the whole idea of humanitarian intervention. If we talk about humanitarian intervention, we're talking about military interventions in other states, in the internal affairs of other states, but which are motivated primarily by humanitarian reasons. So the first point on our slide here says that the United States and the Soviet Union regularly militarily intervened in other states during the Cold War. You can think, if you think about the Cold War period, for example, the United States sends troops into Lebanon in 1958. Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. So obviously there have been many examples of states intervening in the internal affairs of other states for using military force. What I think changed in the 1990s, if you remember in a previous class, we talked about the whole idea of new wars. Wars basically, more often than not, actually breaking out within states, possibly between different ethnic groups, and usually the consequences of these wars spilling over into other states and possibly bringing in outside intervention involving perhaps one or even several great powers. Examples of new wars that we have discussed have included the wars in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. A more recent example might be the situation in Syria today, in which conflict there between the government and opposition forces in Syria has led to, again, to a sort of humanitarian catastrophe in that particular region. What, as a consequence of the new wars in the 1990s, you did see, well, Cotty actually provides quite a long list in this chapter. Here I've included a handful of the examples that he cites, but you do see a series of military interventions purportedly for humanitarian reasons, which was a relatively new development. There were one or two examples in the Cold War of states intervening intervening militarily and justifying the intervention on humanitarian grounds, but there weren't many, and by and large these interventions were frowned upon. In the 1990s, though, as I say, there were several interventions, beginning with, I think this was a UN intervention, but led by the United States in Kurdistan in 1991 to protect the Kurdish people from attacks by Iraqi forces. Somalia, which basically became a failed state in the early 1990s, which resulted in a huge humanitarian crisis. The United States sent in military forces into Somalia in an effort to stabilize the situation there and bring some relief to the people. Yugoslavia, or in this case Bosnia, I mentioned in passing already, Haiti in 1994, and then another intervention in the former Yugoslavia, this time in Kosovo. And all of these could be viewed as say, military interventions underpinned by humanitarian, also motivated by a desire to relieve the humanitarian situation in these particular areas. So as I say, yeah, military force used to intervene in the internal affairs of states for humanitarian reasons. And yeah, if we're talking specifically about Europe, well, obviously Yugoslavia was a European crisis, or a crisis, let's say, on the fringe of the European, of what was to become anyway the European Union at the beginning of the 1990s, which ultimately resulted in European states sending military forces on a peacekeeping mission into Bosnia. But European states also sent forces into other parts of the world, so it was not simply the case that European states were deploying forces in Europe itself, but they were also being dispatched to other parts of the world. So several European states, for example, have deployed their military into Afghanistan. And you can find plenty of other examples. East Timor as well, 1999 to 2000. Some European states sent military forces there on a peacekeeping mission. So yes, historically, several European states have actually been involved in military interventions, as I say, purportedly for humanitarian reasons. Now, the whole idea of humanitarian intervention was controversial. Well, I say was, but still is controversial. Simply because it goes against the classical principles of state sovereignty. When we talk about a sovereign state, or the idea of sovereignty, one of the most, I suppose, sacrosanct elements of that is this idea that external actors have no right to intervene in your own internal affairs. So the idea that outside powers would intervene just because a government was perhaps brutalizing its population, perhaps killing particular groups within a population, that in itself has traditionally was not thought to be a sufficient cause for outside powers to intervene. Under international law, traditionally, the view was that states could only use military force to defend themselves. So as I say, in the light of these various interventions that occur in the 1990s, there is some debate about whether or not there should be a right of humanitarian intervention, or indeed whether this sort of norm was actually developing. It should also be noted that several of these interventions, I think most notably the intervention in Kosovo in 1999, was particularly controversial because there was no sort of legal justification or legal authorization for the war. So in the case of Kosovo, there was not, the United Nations did not pass a Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force, mainly because Russia and China were against the military intervention. Critics of the idea of humanitarian intervention have also pointed to a lack of consistency, saying that Western states have tended to intervene in some cases, but not others. It's notable, for example, that a large number of the various interventions have occurred in states which were oil rich. So there's always been this suspicion that it's sort of economic motivations rather than humanitarian that have underpinned many of these interventions. There's one outstanding example where the international community didn't intervene. That was in Rwanda in 1994, which led to a horrific genocide within that country. Beginning of the 21st century, though, there's this ongoing debate, and there's a general feeling, I think, emerges in the international community that it is not right for states to simply stand by and watch people being killed, brutalized, perhaps en masse in other states. And this leads to a conference, a United Nations conference, I think. Coty talks about this in his book, in which they discuss the idea of intervention and they come up with the notion of responsibility to protect. And this is the idea that as I say, in circumstances where gross human rights violations are being perpetrated within a state, the international community does have the right, perhaps even the moral duty, to intervene to stop this from happening. Now, a couple of years after Cotty's book was published, this principle was actually invoked to justify NATO's intervention against Libya in 2011. Indeed, a UN resolution was passed, a Security Council resolution was passed, which explicitly refers to responsibility to protect when authorizing military action against Libya. And I'll talk a little bit more about Libya in a moment. Now, a major part of military interventions or humanitarian interventions, a big part of it often involves peacekeeping operations. And we have a map here. I appreciate on the PowerPoint it is not very clear, so I'm not going to go through it all in any detail. However, I have actually downloaded the proper map and uploaded it onto the Microsoft Teams. So you can, and you will be able to see the information much more clearly on that. What it does show, as it says, peace operations 2018-2019. First of all, it shows that there are actually quite a large variety of sort of operations. Should be noted that they sort of range from significant or reasonably significant sort of commitments in terms of soldiers to, if you like, much smaller affairs, many of them actually just civilian missions, so not actually involving soldiers as well. Just a quick note, I'll just put my cursor over one or two things. The boxes in dark blue, these are EU missions. So we have one here which is pointing to Ukraine. The boxes in white, OSCE, that's the Organisation of Security Cooperation in Europe. For the most part, these are sort of civilian missions, usually OSCE dispatching small teams of observers to monitor conflict zones and things like that. Again, you can see one of those in Ukraine. In fact, the OSCE has several little missions in Ukraine, according to this map. Another EU mission here, this time sort of pointing through to Georgia. The light blue are UN peacekeeping missions. None of those currently in Europe, mainly I think because the EU and the OSCE has sort of largely taken over the UN in Europe. Oh, tell a lie though, I'm just having a look at the box here, former Yugoslavia. Yes, there are some UN, I think there are some UN civilian forces it's pointing to here. I think this is in Kosovo. But again, a large spread, and as you can see, just looking at the map here, most of many of these sort of missions are actually located in Africa, Central Africa. There are, I think, ongoing operations against some of the more sort of militant Islamic groups in this part of Africa, for example. A few in the Middle East, Afghanistan, these sorts of areas here. But yeah, the map sort of gives you, quite a nice little overview of, if you like, this sort of number of interventions and the organizations that are involved in these sorts of peacekeeping missions. Historically, I think the first UN peacekeeping mission is in the 1950s when the UN forces dispatched into the Sinai Desert to separate Egypt from Israel. What Cotty argues, though, in his book is that peacekeeping basically evolves during the 1990s, that it's no longer simply about sort of maintaining peace, but through monitoring ceasefires in particular areas, but actually military forces deployed in particular areas of the world have a much broader mandate, and if you like, almost a rather more sort of ambitious agenda. And I've actually taken a direct quotation from Cotty's book here. He says these sort of peacekeeping efforts include mediating political settlements, facilitating elections, demobilizing combatants, monitoring human rights, helping to rebuild political and governmental institutions, and economic reconstruction. So as I say, no longer simply just keeping warring parties apart and trying to prevent fighting breaking out between them, but as I say, a much more kind of proactive approach to peacekeeping. And the third point here says that these sorts of operations are often referred to as peace building, or I think perhaps more popularly in things like newspaper articles and the sort of language that politicians use, they're often referred to as nation building. So you're not simply, as I say, deploying forces to maintain peace, but you're actually trying to rebuild a particular state. And usually, again, as the map we just glanced at, usually there are a number of international organizations which can be involved in that. So we mentioned NATO, the EU, the OSCE, the United Nations itself. There might be other sort of regional organizations, often, working, these various organizations and agencies will sort of work together, coordinate their activities. After 9/11, the United States then conducts a series of military interventions in order to counter terrorism and what were labeled as rogue states, that is, states which violated international law and were viewed as major threats to international security. The first intervention is conducted in October 2001 when the United States militarily intervenes in Afghanistan, overthrows the Taliban regime which was governing the country, and US military overruns a number of Al-Qaeda bases there. But this is the first, as I say, in a succession of military interventions. Indeed, at the beginning of 2002, the United States government produces a national security strategy, which, as I say here, emphasizes preemptive military action against terrorist groups and rogue states. What we mean by that is, when we talk about preemption, it means striking before you are attacked. In other words, if you are anticipating being attacked by a terrorist group or another state, then you act before that happens. Now, the idea of preemption is extremely controversial. I mean, traditionally under international law, you can only use military force to defend yourself. So the idea of taking action before you are actually attacked, as I say, that is not something that is traditionally viewed as being something that states are allowed to do. Critics also were worried that this idea of preemption essentially indicated that the United States was about to embark upon an open-ended conflict to deal with all kinds of emerging threats, given that we are now virtually 20 years down the line, so which is almost 20 years, 19 years since, almost 19 years, I suppose, since the terrorist attacks on 9/11, and the United States is still pretty much engaged in this war on terror. It's still using military force in different parts of the world to deal with groups and states that it regards as being a threat. Most recently, of course, the Trump administration launched a drone attack in Iraq, which killed an Iraqi general, and that sort of fits into this ongoing pattern of military strikes and interventions. It should be noted that Afghanistan And as I mentioned, the United States sends its military forces into Afghanistan in October 2001. Afghanistan has now become America's longest war, as I said, 19 years down the line, and there are still US military forces serving in Afghanistan. In terms of the European view about the idea of preemption, I think it's fair to say that the Europeans were rather divided on this issue. Some European governments, notably Britain, to some extent Italy under Silvio Berlusconi, were reasonably sympathetic to the American position. In some ways, I think Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister at that time, he shared a lot of the sort of neoconservative philosophy that influenced the thinking of the Bush administration in 2001. On the other hand, experiences of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya have reduced the enthusiasm for overseas interventions. As I say, the United States is still present in Afghanistan, but both Obama and Trump have been working to try and reduce the US presence. Indeed, the Trump administration is actually now in a process of conducting negotiations with the Taliban in an effort to try and find some kind of political settlement which would allow them to actually withdraw. I'll talk a little bit more about Libya. Iraq too, should be said, the Bush administration, after having occupied Afghanistan, the Bush administration then turns its attention to Iraq. George Bush talks about this idea of an axis of evil, and he names 3 states as representing a direct threat to American security: Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. 2003, the United States goes to war against Iraq, ostensibly to find Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, but also as a result of the war, they overthrow Saddam Hussein's regime. But having quickly secured a military victory over Iraq's forces, the United States then has to occupy Iraq and finds itself becoming, by 2005, 2006, find itself drawn into a very bloody, finds itself fighting against a very bloody insurgency against various groups operating in Iraq. And eventually, of course, the Obama administration eventually attempts to withdraw from Iraq. So in the 1990s, the biggest security problem that Europe faced was the disintegration of Yugoslavia and the war that broke out among the various republics that seceded from the Union. Beginning in 1991 with the secession of Slovenia and Croatia. The following year, 1992, Bosnia also broke away. And I think it's fair to say that the response of the Europeans, certainly in the initial stages of the crisis, was rather ineffective. One thing that does happen is that a United Nations military force is deployed in Yugoslavia on a peacekeeping mission. This is UNPROFOR, the United Nations Protection Force, which is composed almost entirely, I think, of European states. And as I say, its mission was to try and play some kind of stabilizing role. The problem was, though, that it was not equipped to sort of impose a peace settlement, and the soldiers there were therefore rather vulnerable, and some of them were seized as hostages. It was pretty ineffective when it came to trying to prevent atrocities being committed in the region. Should also be noted that in the initial stages of the crisis, the United States was reluctant to take a leading role. The Bush administration, the Secretary of State, James Baker, famously said that the United States did not have a dog in this fight, meaning that there were no American interests at stake in the war in Yugoslavia. When the Clinton administration comes in at the beginning of 1993, Clinton does suggest that the policy should change. The Clinton administration suggests that perhaps the arms embargo, which had been imposed upon all parties in Yugoslavia, should be removed in order to allow weapons to be supplied to, particularly to Bosnian forces, and also that there should perhaps be limited airstrikes against Bosnian Serb artillery positions, particularly those which were located around the Bosnian capital, Sarajevo. The problem was that though that Clinton was reluctant to take a leadership role, and when European states expressed their opposition to this plan, the Clinton administration in 1993, 1994 were unwilling to really, as I say, lead on this and persuade their European partners to accept this line. It kind of reflected, I suppose, Clinton's own indecision or lack of commitment on this issue. It's not until 1995 that NATO ultimately does become involved. And there were various reasons for that, but probably the single most important was the massacre which took place at Srebrenica, where several thousand, I forget the exact number, but we're talking about several thousand Bosnian men, or in fact some of them were pretty young, teenagers included, were seized by Bosnian Serb forces. Srebrenica was supposedly a United Nations safe area and was supposed to be protected by UN forces. There was a small contingent of Dutch troops present at Srebrenica, but they were unable to prevent or unwilling to prevent Bosnian Serb forces appearing, seizing, as I say, Bosnian Muslim men, carting them away and massacring them, and as I say, several thousand deaths as a result of that. When that atrocity was revealed to the world, there was a significant shift and a feeling that something had to be done to bring the war to an end. One result of that, it was NATO finally does intervene. There were limited airstrikes by NATO forces against various Bosnian Serb positions. Also, Croat forces embarked upon a major offensive, the extent to which Bosnian Serb forces were routed, and all the territories that Serbia had sort of gained in the initial stages of the war were lost, which basically forced the Yugoslav government, which by 1995 was basically dominated by Serbia, what was left, the rump of the Yugoslav government, to come to the negotiating table. And Milosevic sort of leads the negotiations with the various other parties. All of them, I've forgotten if I say this on the next slide, all of them are flown out to an American airbase at Dayton, Ohio, and a peace settlement is more or less imposed upon the various parties. Essentially, what happens is, well, first of all, Serbia does not gain the sort of greater Serbia territories that Serb forces were initially fighting for, but effectively Bosnia becomes a sort of quasi sort of federation with different areas of Bosnia, led by the various different ethnic groups. A few years later, then, a similar situation breaks out in Kosovo. Kosovo was actually formerly part of Serbia itself, unlike the other republics which seceded in the early 1990s. But in terms of its population, 90% of Kosovo was ethnic Albanian and Muslim. And war fighting basically breaks out in the late 1990s between Yugoslav military forces, security forces in Kosovo, and the ethnic population. Atrocities are committed, and this time the international community, meaning basically the Europeans and the United States, decide that they are not going to allow Kosovo to become like another Yugoslavia, and they decide they will take action much more quickly. The various parties again were invited to a conference, this time at a French chateau just outside Paris, Rambouillet. A peace settlement is presented to them. The parties basically being again what was left of the Yugoslav government led by Slobodan Milosevic and the leaders, political leadership, I suppose, of the Kosovo Albanians. The peace settlement is presented. Milosevic declines, or the Serb government, Yugoslav government declines to accept this, and again NATO unleashes bombing strikes. The expectation is that it's going to be a replay of the war, the previous intervention in '95, where the bombing campaign lasts just about 2 days, and the Serbs capitulate. This time, though, the war drags on for 11 weeks, and actually NATO, we'll perhaps talk about this in a future class, but NATO goes through something of a crisis during the Kosovo War. Divisions appear within the alliance. Divisions appear between those countries which are enthusiastically supporting the war and those which are, to say the least, reluctant, if not actually in opposition. Greece in particular, Turkey as well, I think, were not happy about the bombing campaign to begin with, and as the crisis drags on, their opposition hardens. Divisions also open up over the way the war should be fought. Clinton, the American president, was adamant that the campaign should be limited to airstrikes. Others, especially Tony Blair, favoured, certainly as the campaign progresses, Tony Blair comes out and argues that perhaps ground forces, soldiers, would need to be deployed. So crisis opens up over that. Eventually, though, Milosevic does capitulate. One of the factors, I think, is that towards the final stages of the intervention, Clinton seems to have reluctantly come to the view that perhaps soldiers would need to be sent to Kosovo after all. The Russians, I think, also basically tell Milosevic that the war continues for much longer. There will almost certainly be some kind of NATO ground intervention. So Milosevic, again, as I say, after 11 weeks, eventually does capitulate, and essentially Kosovo becomes a sort of semi-autonomous entity, formerly part of Serbia, but largely self-governing. And of course, since then, in the years since then, Kosovo has more or less become an independent state, although not all the international community recognizes this. In terms of what it demonstrated, the conflict, as I said there, the war shows the limits of peacekeeping and the importance of the United States in European affairs. Ultimately, in terms of dispatching peacekeeping forces, it turned out that there wasn't much of a peace to keep, and the peacekeeping forces which were sent proved, as I say, kind of incapable of stabilizing the situation in Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. The intervention in Kosovo especially illustrated how significant the United States was in terms of providing security. The United States contributes overwhelmingly to the sort of bombing, so its military contribution is I'd say overwhelming. 90% of the bombing raids over Kosovo were carried out by the United States. I think that Kosovo is also important in terms of future relations with Russia. I mean, Russia was adamantly opposed to the bombing campaign, and the fact that NATO goes ahead intervenes. Kosovo, as I say, ultimately sort of does break away from Serbia. I think this is seen as quite a significant defeat for Russia. And so when one interprets sort of Russian foreign policy in the 2000s and certainly in the more recent events in Ukraine, a lot of this, I think, stems from what actually happens in Kosovo in the 90s, in the late 90s. It's also worth noting this slide discusses, as I say, European involvement in peacekeeping and overseas interventions. And looking through the 90s into the 21st century, one thing that is notable is that Europeans have contributed military forces to what could be described as out-of-area operations or peacekeeping missions. This was evident in the 1991 Gulf War, where a number of European countries contributed military forces. Some of these contributions were very, very small. I think Poland, I can't remember exactly, but I think Poland might even have contributed a sort of handful of troops or maybe military medical personnel. Of the European countries which do contribute to make a military contribution, by far the biggest is Britain, which sends a division. France too contributes a significant number of troops. The rest, as I say, is pretty small, and overwhelmingly, the United States contributes by far the biggest component to the alliance that fights the war. There was kind of smaller scale peacekeeping missions. Again, Coty lists some of them. One worth noting is East Timor in 1999 to 2000, where peacekeeping forces are sent to the region and do include some Europeans. Since then, we could note Afghanistan and the war on terror. Some European forces, including Poland, obviously make a military contribution to the second Gulf War, if you like, or the second war against Iraq in 2003. Then again, as Coty mentions, you can certainly find examples where Europeans have played a leading role, or maybe have made the sole sort of contribution. Often it's been the case that the Europeans have intervened, or some European states have intervened in those parts of the world which once belonged to them as colonies. Good example of that is that France does actually send military forces into Rwanda in 1994. It does very little to prevent the mass killing which is happening there. It was more to sort of protect French interests, I think some French nationals. So it wasn't really effective or even designed, I think, to stop the genocide which was unfolding. Britain does actually launch quite a successful humanitarian intervention in Sierra Leone in 2000. Basically to stop a government that was brutalizing the population there. And again, Sierra Leone was a former British colony. Today, France has quite a strong military presence in West Africa. French soldiers are combating radical Islamic groups in the region. And again, and one example of this is Mali. So these sort of ties between sort of European countries and former colonies, that certainly, that they are still present and still occasionally result in direct military interventions. One thing I haven't put on the slide there, which I should have, and maybe I'll add it, I will amend it and send you a new one, is the intervention in Libya. I think in 2011, I think Libya is interesting because it is in multilateral intervention. It ultimately is a NATO intervention where basically NATO tries to impose a no-fly zone over Libya, and NATO basically intervenes to prevent, I suppose, the Libyan government under Colonel Gaddafi sort of committing mass killings against opposition forces which were fighting against them, particularly Benghazi, a Libyan city which became an opposition stronghold. There were worries that Gaddafi's forces would kind of move into the city and commit mass atrocities there. What's interesting about the NATO campaign, though, is that on this occasion it is not the United States which is really sort of playing a leading role. It's the British and the French. The Obama administration decides to lead from behind, as they put it. And as I say, yeah, it's David Cameron, President Sarkozy, which, as I played the leading role in this during this crisis. At the time, the intervention was seen as a success in that Gaddafi's forces were kind of routed. Ultimately, Gaddafi himself loses power, goes into hiding, eventually captured and then murdered or killed. Should also be said that, yes, the European it's European forces which are playing the sort of leading role in the intervention, but they are very, very heavily dependent on American support. So without US military assets, it would have been very difficult, if not impossible, for the British, the French, and the Italians to intervene in Libya. So it would have been the American role is critical, even though the United States is not playing a leading role in terms of the actual bombing campaign. Of course, since then, the situation in Libya has deteriorated. After Gaddafi was removed, various groups come to power, fighting has broken out. Libya has virtually become a sort of failed state. Which suggests that the intervention ultimately was far from actually successful. And going back to what we said earlier, and I think I mentioned Libya earlier in terms of responsibility to protect, the justification for the intervention in Libya was to protect the Libyan people. Well, ultimately, of course, as I said, the situation there has become extremely unstable. War has broken out, conflict has broken out. Looking at it almost 10 years later, it's hard to view the intervention as being particularly successful. And again, it kind of calls into question the effectiveness of these sorts of kind of external interventions, even if they are sort of motivated by humanitarian reasons. Okay, and I do talk about Libya on this slide. I'd forgotten it was on this slide. Okay. So yeah, as I say, Libya is an example of, again, another sort of NATO military intervention. But as I said, it has failed to be particularly successful. Another example of that would be Afghanistan, where sort of NATO took over the sort of peacekeeping mission in Afghanistan after the Taliban had actually been overthrown. But again, it's hard to see Afghanistan as being can be viewed as being as a particular success. One of the points Cotti makes is that NATO's kind of almost had a sort of dual mission in Afghanistan. On the one hand, it's had to mount a sort of counterinsurgency campaign against sort of Taliban forces. The other part of its mission has been a sort of nation-building mission to try and establish, a reasonably stable and fairly strong Afghan state. And I think it's fair to say that element has proved to be extremely difficult, not least because this sort of insurgency has been sort of ongoing throughout NATO's involvement. One criticism Cotti makes this that perhaps could be made about NATO's role is that at no time critics would argue that simply not enough soldiers have ever been in Afghanistan to really impose order. I think NATO forces have sort of been roughly around the sort of 30,000 level in recent years. Since then, countries have sort of withdrawn. So ultimately, as I say, it's proved very difficult to sort of impose a significant degree of stability in the country, which has made nation building pretty difficult. Again, point number 3, divisions between the United States, which wanted a NATO response force to be sent to Afghanistan on a sort of counter-insurgency mission, and Europeans have sort of emphasized the importance of nation building. So again, as I say, this sort of division between the two sides. Europeans, as I say, perhaps arguing that nation building is perhaps more critical. So Afghanistan, as I say, another area where NATO has been involved, but as I say, it's been America's longest war, and ultimately, the Trump administration now is sort of looking for a way out. And I mean, I think that sort of represents probably the biggest problem for these sorts of overseas missions. You have to ask the question: how long do you want to be there? How many forces are you willing to commit? It's one thing overthrowing the Taliban in Afghanistan, which America was able to do reasonably easily in 2001. Is quite another then to actually sort of reconstruct a viable Afghan state and to kind of maintain order, maintain stability. And as I say, America's been there 20 years, but arguably America and the Europeans through NATO just haven't been willing to commit the necessary resources to construct a viable and stable Afghan state. As we noted earlier, for the European Union, we talked a little bit about the EU as a strategic actor, the fact that the European Union today has its own sort of defence policy, defence identity. On the other hand, the problem for the EU is that it has relatively few military resources of its own, and it certainly lacks the sort of capacity to project its power and project its influence. There's a huge, massive disparity between the capabilities of the United States and those of the EU. On the other hand, again, as our map shows, the EU is sort of committed to various sort of peacekeeping missions and other overseas missions in different parts of the world. Biggest commitment has certainly been in the Balkans. So the EU has been very heavily involved in Bosnia and Kosovo. The map shows that the EU has actually contributed military and policing operations in that region. Again, we're talking about a couple of thousand men, so not a huge sort of military commitment. Other EU missions, which are sort of spread around the world. I think the map illustrated that the EU has a sort of presence in Ukraine and in some parts of Africa, places like that. Many of these, though, are basically civilian and involve advisors, observers, technicians, things like that. So not a military presence. Penultimate point, which I just made, EU does have a very limited ability to project its forces overseas. And the British withdrawal from the European Union, I think that will limit the EU's capacity even further because, as I say, Britain and France are probably the only two real EU states that have the military power to any meaningful degree. The fact that Britain has now left means that the EU's capacity, at least for the time being, is going to be even more limited than it was once. And on that point, I will finish.